Hey, everyone. So, Laud, you'll be up first. And I think your open questions will be useful from the deck.
Fair enough. That's why I put them there.
Yeah.
I think that's a very big debate that we need to address.
Okay. Yeah, ramping up from the break, the Christmas break, is always an interesting exercise.
Yes, it is. Morning, Joseph.
Hey. We don't quite have quorum yet, but there we go. Now we're getting there.
And Laura for Tim will be joining soon. So she just said she was on her way.
Excellent. There we go. Yeah, I'd gotten that notification. Already had it entered.
Good, good. And there she is.
Just
Good morning or evening, depending on where you are, or afternoon.
just need it'd be nice to have Prasoon and Vincat as well. All right, we'll wait till about 5 after. We don't have a extremely heavy agenda, although it depends upon how people react to a lot's open questions, which are good. So we'll wait till about 5 after to get started formally. So Sridhar is, while we're waiting for a couple of procedural things, the meeting times apparently got messed up for different things. I guess this call is correct, but maybe the life cycle and API calls, or did that all get sorted out because of the time change and so on?
I haven't heard anything yet from any of the group.
Oh, really?
If there is a case, please let me know. Yeah.
Okay, so the
Back in the change to standard time, I think there was some
Correct. So
funkiness,
there was some
but
issue
that
in
was
the
fixed.
beginning. Yeah. When the time changed in November first week, there was an issue. But after that, I haven't heard anything from any of.
Yeah, what folks need to do is they need to delete their calendar entries and
Yeah.
download them again from the lists .opi project.org.
all right, that solves that. Okay, it looks like we're still missing Venkat and Pursoon, but I don't want to delay getting started any longer. So we do have quorum because we have 7 of 9. That's an interesting reference.
Yes.
Okay, welcome. Only announcement I have is welcome to 2023. I have 3 agenda items: use case and the use case working group readout from Alad, and he has some open questions. I was hoping we would get at least Venkat so we could continue the lab discussion. And in particular, I think we have to go in front of the board for the February call for the lab. We can't wait any longer than that. I'll have an offline discussion with Venkat and others on readiness. And Stephen, you've been working with Venkat on the lab proposal and so on, correct? Although I guess not much has happened in the last 2 weeks. But.
Kind of tangentially. I mean,
Okay.
He hasn't really pulled me into much of the discussion. Most of it happened behind, virtually closed doors.
Yeah, I need to. Okay, so I need to get him to pull you into that as the with your your working group chair. And all right, so I'll make a point to have a chat with Venkat on that. And then there was a thread that I found interesting, and I actually commented on this morning around quote networking architecture. And I put that in quotes because I think this is a more general thing that we have to address. So, and I'm going to use the word pipeline loosely. So there's a scope overall architecture. I mean, these things are complicated even within companies. There are huge teams that work on kind of the overall architecture for DPUs. In terms of what we have to do in defining chunks of common API, we do need some notion of how the processing all fits together in the end. And there was one of the lifecycle and provisioning calls and API calls where one of the customer companies came in and said, how do we fit our main blocks of processing together in a flexible way? And I think we need to go back to the overall architecture with both the in particular with the API group, and resolve sort of how the whole thing fits together. But that's what the third topic is, again, if we have time. So with that, okay, are there any other agenda items? All right, so let's start.
I have an update real quick. Maybe
Sure.
you even go in announcements.
No, go ahead.
Stickers. I have about 220 stickers left. If anybody wants stickers, send me a direct message and I can send them out. If anybody's got a session that they're attending and they need to hand out stickers at that, let me know how many you need and we'll get them sent. I put a picture of the stickers in the Slack group, the outreach channel Slack group, I think even in the general Slack group as well. Put one on my laptop and to show you the scale and all that good stuff. So just direct message me on Slack and with an address and location and I'll get them sent.
Can't type this morning. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing, and a lot if you would share, and let's get rolling with your update.
Hopefully you can see my screen.
Yes,
Is it in full screen mode now?
yes.
Yes.
Good. Okay, so Paul, here you go. I have the same logo, so this is the sticker you get, probably not for size.
Yep.
But okay, so I don't want to go over in too much detail because most of you have seen this already as far as what the group charter is. Of course, our main charter is in line with the OPI charter, which is create an open channel with the end users as potential deployment partners, share the work being done, which is why I asked recently for more what's new type of an update, because we need to make sure that they understand what we have been up to and what progress has been made, and encourage more users and development partners to contribute, take part, and join, which is again being fed by the latter two points before that. I feel like we're really in line with the project goal by getting the feedback from the groups. The use case group is helping to validate the implementation that we're actually working on and seeing that it does fit into what we're trying to build. We're also trying to build the open community to include additional contributors, as I mentioned, but it's something that we have to do with the outreach together, obviously. So far we've had 3 topics that we've been focused on, and as you all know, we started with security, so basic firewall, rule-based filter. For storage, we added NVMe PCIe to NVMe or TCP bridge, and recently we added OVS. And when we added OVS, Intel came and said, "Hey, what about Kubernetes networking?" Because OVS is OVS, but we believe that K8 would be something that we should discuss, and we definitely had them present to the use case group and have a discussion about it. I don't think we've come to a conclusion, one versus the other, but I definitely think it should be something that we need to look at, specifically because where I'm going next. And by the way, if there are any questions, please feel free to stop me and ask a question. I don't see hands being raised, obviously, because I'm sharing the screen. So please.
Yeah, I'll let you know if somebody raises their hand. Also, this is a really well-behaved group. You can just speak up as well.
Yes, please do.
If somebody misses your hand.
Yeah, please do. So all the calls that I wanted to make were made. We had some issues with charter. They went back and forth a few times. I'm hoping that they'll join shortly, but we still need to have a deep dive with them. I had just had preliminary calls with them. Red Hat is helping me try to pull NTT from Japan in, as well as Telstra from Australia, and as I said, Charter. So those are the 3 that we're focused on right now. Charter from the US, Telstra, and NTT from APAC. And other than that, we've spoken to everybody. Now, it's important for me to state that I believe that some of the companies that we've seen here have taken a step back, which is unfortunate. And the reason is, I think they're feeling like it's not mature yet, meaning that they're still with us, but they're sitting more in the fence now and waiting to see what happens, waiting to see what we can do. Sorry about that. So although the most of the companies here are either members or even contributing members, Some of them have taken a step back. I don't want to name any names, but they're sitting and looking at what we're actually doing rather than actually actively participating, which again, I feel like it's on us to get them to participate again. And I would love the feedback on how we do that. I've got a few ideas, which is what Joe mentioned on the last slide, but we'll get to that. So I think you know this table. This table was the request table. Each company said more or less what they want to see. And I think Keysight was very close to Spirent, so I just didn't add that because as a testing company, as an enabler, they said something very similar. But Venkat has been very helpful, both reaching out, getting contacts, and talking to companies about this, and I encourage everybody to do the same. But this is more or less the table that we've created. And of course, you can see that some things repeat themselves, which caused what we tried to do in the, what are we going for first, which is obviously OVS that repeats itself, the firewall functionality, and the NVMe over TCP, NVMe over Fabric. So that's why we selected those three after discussions with the group. So this is more or less a table, and again, it hasn't changed much, but these are the questions I want us to answer. I think that question 1 and 2 are obviously related, but I'm concerned, and my concern is this. Talking to our friends at Red Hat that are a great part of this group, I asked them a simple question. I asked them, what are you focused on, OpenStack or OpenShift? And they said 100% OpenShift. For the DPU, we need OpenShift. And that answer concerned me because as far as I know, again, my focus is telco mostly. Most telcos are still on OpenStack. They only have a slight footprint of OpenShift. Most of it is OpenStack. And I then queried my friends at other verticals, and they said something very similar. A lot of financial institutions, a lot of big enterprise are still on OpenStack, not OpenShift. They'll go to OpenShift 2-3 years, but they're right now on OpenStack. So if we go hard on OpenShift, we might be missing out on deployments today on partners that deployment partners that are open to it today. I mean, for example, take Verizon. Verizon has been open about this and have discussed it with us and have shared with us what they want. And most of the deployment is OpenStack, not OpenShift. So if we go hard on OpenShift, we might be missing out the short-term opportunity at Verizon. So that's
on that point, Alad. And Stephen, I see your hand, so let me just finish my thought, and then you go. What's the long tail for OpenStack? Does OpenStack have a hard drop off, or is it like, hey, OpenStack's going to be around, indefinitely, for some definition of indefinitely, and so you need to support it? I mean, people don't just shift their entire infrastructure on a dime, right? They bring
exactly.
stages and they have leftover stuff. I mean, the amount of old infrastructure you find in real customer deployments running critical workloads is ridiculous when you talk to them. Sometimes you're like, you're still running that? And they're like, yeah, of course. It just, it works great. And to have new server architectures that incorporate DPUs not encompass that. So I get your point, but I don't think it's a versus. I think it's what's the progression of deployment environments that we have to comprehend and make sure we're recovering.
I agree, Joe. The reason why I said versus is because of the very clear answer I got from Red Hat, which said, nope, not OpenStack, just OpenShift. And I agree with you. It needs to be both. But I know that's a tall order.
Okay. Stephen.
Yeah, so we have had some, speaking from a Red Hat perspective, we have had some, internal discussions around OpenStack. I won't say that it's 100% only OpenShift. There is definitely some, interest even internally in Red Hat around OpenStack support for DPUs. But I also want to point out that, just because OpenStack and OpenShift are different technologies doesn't mean that they can't be used together. As an example, you could use OpenShift to manage the DPUs themselves, but still only run OpenStack on the hosts.
Yeah, I completely get that, and indeed that was a part of the discussion with our friends, with your colleagues. But I think
And as Kyle pointed out, I should be careful. I don't necessarily need to say OpenShift. I could just say Kubernetes, right?
yeah,
So
yeah,
it's
of course.
Kubernetes versus OpenStack, right?
Yeah. So indeed, and that's why I started with Kubernetes networking versus traditional, because that is really a point as well. It's just that OpenStack versus OpenShift gives it a little bit of a color in my mind. And again, I understand your point, but think about, again, I'll focus on Verizon because that's a very good example for me. They have OpenStack today deployed. 80% of the deployment is OpenStack. If we go in and we say the DPU is run by OpenShift, then that lowers their enthusiasm a little bit, because they'll say, okay, so we'll put it on the 20% that we have, and maybe later we'll take more, which makes them think this is not something that they should deploy on the wide scale. Although, if you remember, they're a member, they were very excited to begin with. They really wanted us to see put multiple workloads on the DPU and then talked about service chaining. So my fear is we're losing the attractiveness of the offer, at least for the short term. And long term, who knows what will happen, right? But short term, most of my points here are around that. Short term, we're losing traction, which is painful for me to see. So I see that there's chat. I just don't see the chat itself. So if there's something in the chat that I should be addressing, please let me know.
Really, it's around, products versus open source. And in here, we really should be talking about open source, right? So we really should be replacing OpenShift with Kubernetes.
And that's fine. And that's fine. I mean, I don't mind calling it OpenStack versus Kubernetes. I just gave an example. But let's go to the next example, which is, are we going to address 5G workloads for telcos like GRE, eBPF, EVPN, stuff that came from Ericsson, Nokia, and others that we spoke to. And the question around that is because there are other bodies, obviously ORAN and others, that are deep dive into this. So if we want to combine our efforts with them, we need to go more in that direction. I'm not saying we should, I'm just raising it as a question. And the final question is something that I struggle with, which is, I feel like we're at least initially, my thoughts were, oh, we have people like F5 or alike on this group, in this community. And why don't we bring out something of theirs, something that is already a real workload, like an actual product to start with, to demonstrate some abilities? And I was told, no, let's focus on the bits and pieces and build towards it. That's fine. But again, my concern is we're losing traction because of it, because we're not showing something that is really deployable in the short term. So those are in a gist of my questions.
So, I mean, this partly is coupled to our, release model discussion, right? And the discussion with around IPDK as well, right? Because, quote, real world deployment, again, we aren't a complete open source stack for DPUs at this point, right? Everybody agree with that? I think that because that's where we ended up in November, early December. So if we're primarily defining API definitions and some combinations of code that work together with some amount of open source to support that, but not a complete open source project, then real world deployment is an interesting point to bring up. I mean, are you saying that, look, from what you see from your use case group discussions and your industry-wide discussions around OPI, that we actually need to be a complete open source stack to be relevant? Or expand some more on that. Maybe some other
Okay,
people. have-
allow me to expand. So let's talk about who are we actually targeting. We're not targeting the cloud guys. I mean, the tier one cloud guys in most cases, because they have their own teams, they have their own perception, and they have their own DPUs in most cases, either already selected or they have a mix, but they can take care of their own. We're targeting people that have a team but do not do their own development, meaning that even if you give them open source tools, in most cases they will not develop their own code. Rather, they would want to see us get into a high level where we engage with the F5s, with the Ciscos, with the Junipers, with everybody, and make them take use of what we've built in order to bring something out to the world. Again, think about service chain as well, where they would probably use the DPU for multiple purposes. And it could be 5G, it could be security, it could be something else like storage, and everything needs to play together. So the fact that we're bringing out APIs is great, but eventually we'll need to feed them something that they can actually consume. Most of the work will not be done by them. So I think that what I'm seeing from our clients is, from the deployment partners is, they're saying, okay, great. It's great that you're working on it. We understand the cause, really important. When you're finished, let us know. And this is the wrong thing, because when you finish, let us know is what led to the demise of many open source communities and projects in my mind. So what I'm trying to say is, I think we need to change the perception a little bit and think about, okay, we're developing APIs, we're developing frameworks, we're defining them, we're saying what are we planning to use, but then we need people like F5, Juniper, Cisco, whomever, to take that and say, hey, here is a product that rides on top of or uses what OPI is used and already works. And here's the turnkey, here's the key to the kingdom. So take this, any of the DPUs, IPUs, take the OPI package and take our stuff, and it works. Because if we don't do that, what we're looking at is, again, either a client deployment partner that says, okay, I know how to do this, and they will connect the dots, or nobody will connect the dots, and then we're just defining something that people would use in the far future or not at all. That's at least my perception.
Thoughts from anyone?
I'd like to see it get a little more airtime within other companies that are participating. There's a lot to think about here, and there's a lot to share. And I'd like to see what kind of feedback we get internally from F5, like you were saying, Elad, and other communities as well that do similar things to what we do.
Yeah, and Kyle had the comment, says, in my mind, if the only thing we're doing in OpenAI is enabling vendor products, we will have failed from the start. That type of open source project never works unless a single vendor starts it. We should be enabling common APIs across DPU, IPU devices as the main goal. The common APIs allow for the consumption of DPU, IPU devices, which will allow for what Elad wants to grow. In other words, the fact that the DPU vendors and the people supplying additional software on top of the DPU hardware, usually in conjunction with the vendor stack, although that isn't strictly required, it's generally the case. If I've got multiple DPU models and DPU vendors, having a common way to configure them and a common set of tools defined. So again, in lifecycle and provisioning, we've picked several tools already, and that journey continues. OTel, for example, Secure ZTP, for example. That goes a long way into allowing a solution provider or a large customer that isn't a tier 1 cloud, to your point, a lot, to use DPUs and avoid vendor lock-in. And the primary customer drive here is we don't want to be locked in. Now, the struggle between the piecemeal component and API definition versus, hey, we're doing the whole thing, is one of, essentially time and effort, right? So if we were, if you were if we had, let me guess, 5 times as many active developers and the attendant, oversight and whatnot people, we might be able to take on, hey, here's a complete thing you can get as an open source to run on the DPU, and all the vendors provide essentially their SDK integration to the bottom of that, and then you're done. You have one open source stack, and everyone can then develop additional applications to go alongside that, or on top of that, or to orchestrate that, or there's another half dozen things I could list off. But that's to get commitment for that approach, we have to show success with the lesser included problem of individual components and piecewise APIs. And the gap between what I just said and what we were saying earlier, the problem is, how big is that gap and can we cross it? That's, I think, the point a lot is bringing up.
Indeed, I think, forgive me, Joe, but
No, go ahead.
I think that the selling point is clear, and forgive me for using some sales marketing jargon here, but the sell point is clear. We're making the world a better place by opening it up, releasing the vendor lock-in. Everybody loves that. Everybody that I spoke to loves that. They think, yes, you guys are doing the exact right thing right now. The world is shaping up with IPUs and DPUs. You're doing the exact right thing. The problem is they're saying, okay, when you're done, show us. And that statement is because they do not have the ability to do it themselves. And currently we're doing bits and pieces, the APIs, the provisioning, which is great, and which is the underlying technology, but we're stuck in a bit of a chicken and egg. Because on the one hand, we're saying, come join us, come contribute, come talk to us. And in the beginning, at least, they were eager to do so, but now it's diminishing. And on the other hand, we're saying, deploy it at the end of the day. And we're not quite there yet. So basically, most of the people that I speak to are saying, yeah, we'd like to use that and would like to do that, definitely. But first of all, show us that you have something that we can use, and show us that you're serious, because we're not convinced yet that you guys are building something that we'll be able to use. And again, it goes to the OpenStack versus Kubernetes. It goes into what workloads are you working on. It goes into what are you actually going to be able to deploy when this is done. And again, it's creating a chicken and egg problem. And that's what I feel we should be addressing, because again, I feel like we're losing traction with the people that need it the most, which are the people that do not have the internal abilities to develop their own code and actually build on top of what we're building.
Yeah, the traction problem is always an interesting one for these things, right? Because one approach says, hey, if it's like Redfish and all of the vendors and all of the integrators and software providers on top of those vendors agree that this is the interface outward, even if it's for pieces, right? Because Redfish was built in stages and pieces. then everyone who's going to buy those things, buy the devices, go, you support Redfish, we'll do our tooling for Redfish. And now with minor changes, we can incorporate, servers from, Dell and HPE, just, to use one example. And, it's just like, if x86 is primarily, mostly x86, then with minor differences, I can swap out Intel and AMD. If ARM is ARM, then, I can pick what ARM chips I use. So on the other hand, if somebody said, well, I really want kind of this complete stack. And again, that open source for complete stack on the DPU, is probably a useful end goal, as we've talked about before. But getting there requires a lot more effort than the member companies so far are, able to put in. And I won't say willing, because willing's really the wrong sentiment, but the ability to commit resources to something like this, to do that scope of a project is interesting, right?
And that's my point, Joe. I think that this is why I called it the chicken and egg problem, because the ability to apply resources is due to customer demand. And we cannot generate customer demand if we don't show them that this is real and this is something they can deploy short term. So it's actually feeding each other in my mind.
Other thoughts? I mean, Alad and I have gone back and forth with a little bit from Stephen and Kyle. Are there other thoughts from the team? I mean, do you guys think this is something we have to address and deal with at the TSC level? Is this something that we need to discuss with the board as well in terms of overall, charter and mission statement? This is, I mean, it's a tough question, actually. I am not used to this group being quite this shy.
If I weren't standing in, I'd be being really noisy. I actually think this, I hear what you're saying, and I think this is actually a board conversation, because it's sort of a conversation about the fundamentals of what everybody's trying to do. Right. Which makes it make sense that everybody's being quiet on the call.
Right. All right. Well, think about this over the next week, and we can see if people develop a perspective and our opinion on it that we can go over in the next call. But I mean, I get the contention, and this, has always been a concern. And again, I had the view that I expressed, which is, if we define some components in common and we start defining the necessary APIs to cover some of the use cases, then we've actually gone a long, that's actually going a long way to making DPUs more, to accelerate the deployment of DPUs, is what I should say. And I think everyone on this call wants that to happen, right? Both the large end users, the kind of system and solution builders, as well as the DPU providers themselves. So, all right. Now 5G. So trying to take on all of 5G is so we're not going to define all those APIs, right? Open RAN and other consortiums define most of the direct 5G related APIs. On the other hand, DPUs are a good way to offload much of that processing. And the underlying networking and data flow and packet processing structures are implemented by DPUs and should be covered by OPI. So it's not like you're going to go and try and define APIs out from under, say, an ORAN. On the other hand, whatever ORAN defines, it would be nice, well, nice is the wrong word. I think it's critical for 5G that that matches up to APIs we are defining.
Yeah, Joe, what I tried to do here is to talk about sales and BD, right? Sales is the pieces where how do we approach client directly? BD is how we partner with Cinia and ORAN and Dash and all of those other groups that are doing the work. So we build something stronger together, and we explain to the world how DPUs and IPUs bundle under all of those mindsets. So it's really all about just collaboration and trying to match up, as you said correctly, match up our APIs and our agendas around those as well.
Right. All right. Any other thoughts on the use case group? Can you go back to your slide that had the needs and wants from, yeah, that slide.
So in this slide, you can see that Ericsson is very different than the others, simply because of what I mean, on the provisioning, they're pretty much the same, but on the routing and the security, they're different. And this is because of their focus on telco and 5G specifically.
Yeah, although honestly, it's not so different, right? There's a big overlap between Verizon and Ericsson in reality. And some of the others like, Rakuten, to do the active replication from a DPU, you would do a lot of what's, in the other companies.
Yeah, but speaking about telco, and again, this is because this is close to my heart. We're talking about different networks, meaning that Ericsson is focused on the far edge or edge, while Verizon actually turned to us to talk about their internal cloud or their internal IT infrastructure mostly. So there are elements that are similar, I agree, but in most cases, what Comcast, Bell Canada, and Verizon and Charter speak to us about is not that edge, but rather the more core network.
Yeah, I mean, other than yeah. I don't know, does anyone else have any comments or questions on this table? I guess what would be interesting is does large enterprise and mid-range enterprise have a different set of value, value proposition for their use of DPUs.
So that's a great question, Joe. And I spoke to a friend of mine at Walmart, and I spoke to a few others. That's why I mentioned big financial institutes like banks. And while the actual names are a little bit different from time to time, but the requests are still the same. They still have the same routing elements, the same security elements, the same storage elements. But in those organizations, there's even less focus on networking internally as far as development, meaning their IT teams and their development teams are even weaker. So in most cases, some financial institutions, they have very strong teams inside. But in most cases, I mean, if you look at Deutsche Bank, if you look at Walmart, if you look at Target, if you look at people of that nature, you'll see that their teams inside need much more help. They need to be fed with a spoon, basically. So they're even, in my mind, they're even less ready for this than the telcos are.
Right, but so the question is, do they have a set of requirements? Again, assuming that an integrator or a solution provider gave them, more turnkey. And again, there are lots of possible providers for that, and we don't focus on any one of them. But they're very concerned about lock-in. So, but do they have a different set of requirements than you have listed here? And is that worth compiling for the use case group?
So well, when I tried to do that, I had that exact thought, Joe, to be honest. And when I tried to do that, they really fell into very similar buckets, but they weren't as coherent as these guys were. Meaning that Verizon, Comcast, and Bell Canada has been very coherent. Charter as well have been very coherent about what they want. When I spoke to the enterprise guys, and again, I spoke to their VP of cloud, he basically said, look, we're building our cloud strategy now. We're up until now, we bought off the shelf only, and we haven't really been too open to define DPUs, IPUs. We understand that the industry is going that way. We understand we should be talking to it, especially people like Walmart that want to compete with Amazon, right? But they're at a much earlier stage. So they said, I told them what we're doing. I told them a little bit about what we're building, and they said, yeah, it makes sense that you're doing that. And indeed, we would use the Junipers and the F5s and those type of applications. In most cases, they said they're multi-cloud. So they asked, are we going to be in the clouds as well? They want their internals to match in most cases. But it didn't sound very different. It just sounded they're not as prepared.
Yeah, on that point of they want this to match what's in the cloud. I mean, typically with a cloud, you don't directly see what they're doing with GPUs. Like you don't see Nitro when you deploy your stuff.
Exactly.
You see deploying your stuff. In fact, that AWS wrote their entire system to hide the fact that Nitro's in there, other than to tell you, hey, we've got Nitro, which makes it so much better, right? So they tell you all about it, but then you don't see Nitro, not really. I mean, you may go, oh yeah, of course they're doing it with DPU offloads, but as far as I have read and experienced, you don't. It's not like you go configure a Nitro card or some aspect of a Nitro card, right? And again, somebody can correct me if like.
No, you're absolutely right, Joe. You don't see it, you don't touch it, and now that some of our counterparts in this community have deployments coming on other clouds, you won't see those either.
That's right.
The end client will not be able to play with them. What they're saying is that they understand that it's needed. They understand that we have capabilities around it. They are not mature enough in most cases. The networks that I spoke to are not mature enough to be able to handle it. If you give them a turnkey, then they'll gladly look at it, but they're not as mature as again, they don't have the right teams in most cases again, other than a few financial institutions that do because they're focused on networking, if their focus is not networking, the chances of them being able to consume something which is a little bit raw, a little bit more open is difficult. So think about the example of Sonic. I think that that's a great example that I always use with enterprise because when you have Sonic, they are open to taking a switch with Sonic that just works. But if you told them, here is Sonic, go and develop something of your own or fork, they'll be a little bit reluctant.
Right, but the trick with Sonic is, there are a couple of sets of well-defined APIs that let you configure Sonic. And so if I was Sonic,
But there's another element to that, Joe, which is people that actually develop the OS, meaning that they give you something that you can actually deploy. So they don't just give you the APIs. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but they don't just give you the APIs.
Right. This was our early discussion on, do we take the pure standards approach? Do we take the Redfish hybrid open source approach, or do we try to do what Sonic did for DPUs? And we decided on the middle approach. And what you're saying is, I get practically why we decided on the middle approach, but the middle approach has the flaw of not being like Sonic was.
Well, what I'm saying is that
somebody could just take OPI and put it on the DPU and they're done.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, if you want to go after the enterprise, the more simple enterprise, you need something that just works, and then you need a more Sonic approach. But if you want to define the APIs and go just the Redfish approach, as you mentioned it, then we need to go after clients that are a little bit more sophisticated, which is why the table is populated with those.
Yep. Okay. Got it. All right. Any final thoughts on this? I just want to introduce the last one, which is, in quotes, networking architecture, but I don't think it applies to just networking. So any final thought on this?
Joseph, sorry.
Good.
I have one feedback that we got from our discussions with plenty of vendors. I agree with everything that was said in this discussion about the deployment and the readiness of cloud vendors, small cloud vendors, to adopt the technology. One thing that I see here is the mix with the BMC and secure boot. The feedback that we got is that the BMC and secure boot is managed by a different team, and trying to mix it together with DPU is another level of war that we will have to fight. That is will make it very difficult to get the DPU to include another function that is currently not part of the DPU, not part of the smart NIC, not part of the NIC. And we see a lot of resistance. So when you talk with customers, you will see probably a similar approach.
It's a good point. Chris?
I was just going to say, with our hybrid approach that you were talking about, isn't there still the opportunity that somebody could take then what OPI creates and make a productized version that's supported and more prepackaged and stuff to address the more enterprise customer use case that needs to be turnkey? In other words, if we develop OPI to address the more advanced users, then somebody else could package it and create it as a product that will address the enterprise users after that.
Oh,
Yeah.
definitely. The question is who?
Well, okay. We probably can't discuss who on this call, but as a general point, that is actually also, that is correct, right? That's why I keep saying solution providers, integrators, system providers can definitely take OPI, use it across multiple DPUs, and provide something that's deployable to customers. Now, again, big telcos and guys like that, as Alad points out, can also do that for themselves. In other words, they can take the fact that API's got these components, OPI has these components, and the API is defined, and do that for themselves to provide it for, SME to large enterprise and even SMB, because there are use cases there that make financial sense. Certainly a company that sells systems and solutions and makes components of those could assemble something that obeys all the OPI and even exposes some of that to the customer, hides some other parts of it, uses that with the DPU vendors. And in fact, a DPU vendor could do very much the same thing and say, hey, look, we're OPI compliant, here's our stack. So, but I don't want to get into specifics because I don't want, on who could exactly do what. Although in point of fact, I know across the industry some of who and what could be doing what. And yes, I'm dancing around as a vague thing. So Chris, you're exactly right.
Right. I think my point was more or less, was not so much who could do it, but the point that enterprise customers are going to want support more than an open source community kind of support, like an actual, entity they can call that has 24-hour response time, So I think those companies that are less advanced are going to want that second model anyways. So I sort of feel like we're okay in that hybrid approach where, the more sophisticated users might directly take OPI, but I think a lot of customers are going to want the, productized version that various providers could create.
Yeah, and there are people who do that already for existing open source projects, and that model works, and there are clear examples of it. Sonic being the one that's immediately pops to mind. If you look at Sonic, community Sonic is really only taken by certain very large deployers of it, and they modify it and to their purpose. All the rest of Sonic that's deployed is supported by one or more vendors of networking equipment or integrators of networking equipment that then support that Sonic. And typically they add pieces to Sonic and so on. And again, without getting into specifics, you can go look up the whole Sonic story and see how that fits together. And so as Chris points out, the similar thing can apply here, even though we don't have all the components that would make it a exact Sonic analog. Each of the individual components on the DPU can follow the same model, and the set of individual components covers actually, we'll start to be able to cover a lot of the DPU use case space. So it's a good point, Chris, and I agree with you. All right, any final thought from anyone? We'll pick up the kind of end-to-end architecture pipeline versus pipeline definition versus API definition and all that. We'll pick that up next time, along with going back to the lab discussion, which I had requested, kind of a full review for next time. All right. If you have any topics or want to discuss anything, just reach out. Happy to do that. Otherwise, we are done. Thank you very much. Thank you, Alad. That was an excellent discussion.